Hello, my name is Ian Watson, and I am a Director Emeritus of the American Membrane Technology Association. The interview you're about to see is the 31st in a series of what we call Chats with the Pioneers. AMTA is a technical association founded on the advocacy of the use of membrane technology for water treatment, from wastewater reclamation and reuse to seawater desalination. The heart of this technology is the membrane itself. About 3.5 years ago, our board of directors decided that to preserve the history of membrane and membrane system development, the association should make an effort to record these chats with the pioneers and those responsible for launching what is now technology in common use throughout the world. AMTA's intent is to make segments of these chats available on our website so that a new generation of engineers and scientists can understand the efforts of those pioneers that helped solve some of the water issues facing the world today. With me today I have three gentlemen. On my immediate left, Mr. Dean Spatz, David Paulson, and Francis Lightly. If you would, Dean, would you like to give me a little bit about your background in this area?
Okay, well, I'll start in this area. Was the first time I worked on reverse osmosis was 1963. I was a sophomore at Dartmouth College, and it was a project we had to figure out what to do with brackish water. And Chris Miller and I actually got very interested in reverse osmosis at the time. The dean of the engineering school knew Dr. Surya, who invented the first membrane in 1959 at UCLA. And Surya had moved to Canada at the National Research Council. We then got a contract with Office of Saline Water. Dr. Chana Basapa was in charge at that time in 1965 and continued that through 68. I have a bachelor's degree at Dartmouth and a master's in engineering management in Dartmouth, and graduated in 1968. And then my first job ended up in Minneapolis with a company that was supposed to start reverse osmosis, and I was supposed to be their head of their group. They never did what they said, so in 1969 I broke off and started Osmonics. So.
Good, thank you. Dave, what about you?
I was a junior in 1969 in high school, and Dean hired me to clean up the first, when he moved out of his garage into a machine shop, he hired me to clean up the machine shop. And so I started working on reverse osmosis sometime after that on part-time basis, assembling pieces and little machines and stuff like that after school or on summer vacation, etc. And my educational history is definitely not usual for a technical guy, in membrane included, but maybe not. I studied sociology and psychology and ended up with a degree while I was working at Osmonics, got a degree in chemical dependency counseling, and chose not to stay in that field after like 1 month of working nights for the county. I went back to reverse osmosis and was there basically ever since and have never left the field.
Good. Actually, may have been a useful degree to have.
Yeah.
I can assure you I didn't apply my technical knowledge there in the organization, no.
Fran, I noticed from your bio that you spent some time in the RO industry and also outside in some rather interesting areas. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I never spent too much time in any one job. I kind of moved around quite a bit in my lifetime, and I graduated from college in '66 with a bachelor's in chemistry, and my first employer was Honeywell, and at that time they were Minnesota's biggest employer, and I was working in their ordnance division. So at that time they were busy making bombs and mines and torpedoes for the Vietnam War, and I worked in couple different locations around the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. And in one of those, I was in a chemical and metallurgical lab that did quality control and lab testing for some of the different operations in the building, one of which was metal finishing. And I think it was probably when I was reading through metal finishing magazines that I came across an ad for Osmonics and realized they were a local Twin Cities company and were actually advertising that they had like metal recovery systems from metal finishing rinse waters, especially in nickel. And so it was probably about 1970 that I contacted Dean, interested in a job, and he said, well, I don't think we're quite ready to hire our fourth employee yet, but if you want to come in a few evenings and that sort of thing, we can probably work on some tests and projects that you might fit nicely into. So I think I did that probably for 6 or 8 months, and finally Dean decided he was ready to hire that fourth employee, and I started in '71 with Osmonics and spent 12 years there, and I think that's the longest I ever stayed in one job in my whole career.
You got to tell them why you quit.
Why?
Do you remember what you told me? You said we got too big. We had 100
Oh, that's
people.
right. Yeah, I kind of felt like I was going from Minnesota's biggest employer to one of their smallest when I made that move, and then when Osmonics grew by 10 or 20 fold, yeah, I decided it was getting too big also.
And what were you doing while you were at Osmonics?
Mostly applications work, you know, looking at new things, doing what we called application testing, where we would bring in somebody's waste stream or food product or whatever it was, and see what we could do with it, and you know, whether it worked or didn't work with RO or UF or whatever.
Well, we really should tell them, Frank, since this is to do with membranes, even more than the machinery in that. We developed the coating machine in '72 using a guy that had an adhesive coater, and he helped us develop it, and we developed the coating machine. But and we were making cellulose acetate membranes, but we needed to work on improvements in the membranes, and we couldn't do it during the work day. So Fran and another one of my early employees, Doug Olson, would come in on Sundays, and we'd work on the coating machine to get all the bugs out of it and get into other membranes. And Fran was is a big Vikings fan, and would bring his TV, and so we wouldn't miss the Vikings game while we were doing that. You remember that, of course.
Oh, yes.
So you had, when you started Osmonics, did you start it as a membrane company or as a systems company or both?
Well, you need to go back to the work I did at Dartmouth, because one of the things I did at Dartmouth was the contract was to prove that that RO membranes could run at 50 psi and still be good, because that was some things that everybody claimed you had to be at 600 at that point. And so we made membranes in our lab, and we actually made a small coater that was 12 inches wide, and we had test cells, and then we made spiral elements that we put into the field. That was all during that time that I had the contract off Saline Water. So when I started Osmonics, I always planned to make our own membrane. Mm-hmm. But when you start a company, you need to make money. And so the easiest thing was to use, actually, in that case, Roga membranes, because they were starting to sell the spiral element. And then we worked with Eastman Kodak, who had developed a very nice cellulose acetate membrane, and rolled the Eastman Kodak membranes into spirals as we were getting ready to make our own. And so all along we were planning to be in membranes, but we also did a lot in new applications and water treatment.
Yeah.
In fact, my philosophy was always we wanted to have half our business consumables and half our business equipment, which we did.
And how long did it take you before you were able to develop the first, let's say, commercial membrane?
Well, I think that we started to roll our own membranes commercially. What do you think? 73, Fran?
Sounds about right.
73. We were coating in 71, 72, but a lot of that was Kodak membrane, and then we developed our own probably about 73.
And where did you fit into all this, Dave?
Well, I started doing a lot of different jack of all trade kind of things in the shop, and I did not work on developing those membranes, but I did work on the element and testing the elements and figuring out where the seal should go, et cetera. And early on, I got the assignment that I had for quite a long time of evaluating all the returned elements for warranty. And that was a good insight into how they were built and stuff. And the first ones I do remember some of the like Roga elements coming back all telescoped because they had an inadequate telescope and stuff. So I kind of segued into product engineering, you might say, but at that time when there's 10 people in the company, you were doing everything, you didn't have a title. So I actually was, for a short time, supervisor of membrane rolling. I spent a lot of time looking at returns because there were a lot of returns that we opened up to find out why they weren't working, and writing letters to people saying, here's why you don't get warranty, except maybe once in a while you get warranty and you got to treat your membranes better, things like that. So, and I just kept going at that kind of position until I was given the assignment of the quality control department for a while, and then about 1980, 79, 80, Dean came and said, why don't you take over the R&D department, which was one guy who was on his way out, and now you're R&D. That was 1980. So all that time, up until then, doing pretty much a little bit of everything.
Yeah, we used to, from the other side of the fence, we always used to say a membrane warranty was good until you loaded them in the vessel.
Right.
This was mainly, well, in those days it was all 4-inch, I guess. Did you make smaller ones?
It was all 4-inch, and in fact, we had a lot of difficulty, with the pressure vessels in those days because everybody was coating them with epoxy.
Right.
And of course, they'd chip off, and that we were using Schedule 40 pipe. So we were the first to make a stainless steel housing, and so we actually had our own run of stainless steel tubing that had the exact ID of the Schedule 40. And that helped us get into a lot of food applications and other things other than straight water treatment. And Fran was active at that point in those developments, and I think Dave also, because we were one of the first ones, I think, to do an injection molded end cap as well.
Yeah, and you kept the stainless steel vessels for a long time.
We did. We went to 8-inch.
Yeah.
And kept it for a long time. And in fact, Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola both insist on stainless steel vessels. And a lot of the other food people, I don't know if GE is still doing stainless steel vessels or not, but prior to the time that they acquired us, there were a lot of people that specified the stainless steel.
Right, right. And during this time, Fran, you were working on product development as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
For a period of time in the mid-'70s, I was manager of engineering at Osmonics, and even though I wasn't really an engineer and I wasn't a draftsman, we had other people that could do those kind of things, but I handled that department, and yeah, product development both in the elements and in the systems was certainly part of what I worked on.
One of the things that I recall about osmonics is that you seem to have a business plan which targeted what I would call niche industries, metal pasting, waste recovery, food and beverage industry, and so on. Was that deliberate, or was that just the way it developed for you?
It was deliberate. I always considered myself a businessman first and an engineer second. I always felt that I would take Surya Rajan's work and bring it to the marketplace. So that was kind of a personal thing. But as I looked at the competition and the prices that people were selling equipment, especially the California people, I decided that it was really tough to make good money doing that, and that making money and being profitable was the key thing. So as we did that, we were offering to do testing and product development for things, or process development, which is where both Dave and Fran did a lot of that. And we got into a lot of specialty things. The pollution control, was very strong in the 70s. We got into a lot of pollution control. We got into recycling of the heavy metals, like the nickel
And some high or critical applications like medical, kidney dialysis,
Right.
That's right. We were
bottled
right.
bottled water, or actually it wasn't bottled water as much as it was makeup water for soft drinks and stuff. So, but that's one thing that, from my perspective, not having Dean's perspective, what I saw was that we were trying to find out where the technology would work, period. And we had a system of harvesting anybody's interest at all and seeing if this technology would work on this new application.
Right.
And I think we're kind of unique. I think Coke membrane was the other one that, from the UF perspective, looked at a lot of industrial applications. We called them process. Dean had divided the world up into waste, process, and water treatment in terms of how you looked at the marketplace. We did a lot of the process and waste treatment compared to other RO companies and UF companies.
Yeah, I think because most of the this is about the time that I entered the industry in
Right.
the early 70s. Most of the companies that were around at that time were concentrating more on the drinking water market and not so much on the other side of the picture.
Right. To give you an idea of a couple of things that were very good businesses for us was certainly cheese whey fractionation using our UF, and the other one was actually a nanofiltration application where we desalted red dye. When they made red dye, FDC red dye, they ended up with the reaction, and then it had a fair amount of salt. So we would concentrate the red dye, desalt it at the same time, and that was a very nice business.
Yeah.
I have some more history on why we could do that or why we knew about red dye too. It came out of the fact that we were using red dye as a quality control indicator to see how good the membrane was, and then I started using it to find out and often prove that cellulose acetate membrane had hydrolyzed. And I learned through just a lot of experience of stuff coming back, and then I'd go in and talk to Dean. He'd say, "Oh, that's because it's hydrolyzing. You got to look at this." And I'd found out that salt passage would start going down before the red dye would break through. So after a while, when a company came and ran an application test with us, as a matter of fact, two of them did, we just sort of invented a membrane right there, and we hydrolyzed the membrane when we weren't getting enough salt passage and gave it a new nomenclature for these guys. And that's the one that I had mentioned earlier to you. One of the two customers patented it, and that a fight over a patent and infringement went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the doctrine of equivalence was kind of redefined by the Supreme Court on that. And that went all the way back to 1982 when we ran two application tests for two customers back to back, 1 week apart on red dye. So it was a real coincidence.
Yeah, because about that time, I guess, Fluid Systems, Roger by that time become Fluid Systems. Fluid Systems introduced their first nanofiltration membrane in Florida at Pelican Walk, I think, which was a hydrolyzed CA membrane.
Right. You know, I knew a lot of the guys at Roga, not closely, but knew them because we'd all had the same OSW contracts. And so I think we were all kind of thinking the same way, but we were looking at finding value in it. So.
In fact, it was 1983 when Peter Erickson over at Film Tech coined the term nanofiltration, and before that, everybody was calling these things loose RO, and I found that so offensive that we wrote our reports just RO/UF because we couldn't find a term for this this membrane. Loose RO sounded like a problem, you know, like we're selling you the stuff that's not working.
That's right. Well, the primary application in Florida was, of course, we were softening and THM removal, so we called them softening membranes.
Right. Yeah.
I've been studying and researching the history of NF and trying to find out where where the stuff started, and so far this red dye one is what I found is the oldest industrial or process nanofiltration.
So this
application.
The concept for nanofiltration membrane arose out of your investigation of membrane damage by hydrolysis, basically.
Well, I actually knew we could make something like that by controlling the pore sizes differently because, and of course, you know, the guys at Roga don't talk pore sizes, but I'm a Soyarajan guy and you talk pore sizes. But by controlling the pore sizes during the casting process, we were able to get a membrane that would reject maybe 60%. But it wasn't as predictable as we liked, and so the idea of hydrolyzing it actually made it a better nanofiltration because it passed more salt, and the pore size was more predictable because you were starting with a big pore, with a very small pore size, and then you were just hydrolyzing enough to get it.
That's a good description. I went back and read those reports, and we actually tried. We had a 50 CA that we cast to not reject all membrane, and that didn't. We tested that, but we also tested the hydrolyzed CA and found out the hydrolyzed CA worked better for these food grade dyes.
Well, and the other beauty of hydrolyzed CA is it's more hydrophilic, so it stayed cleaner. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Now, Fran, I noticed from your bio that you went off into what should we say, the food and beverage industry.
You might say that, yes. A little of both.
And there looked at some applications in the winemaking business. What are the membranes used for in winemaking?
Well, I didn't go into it to use membranes. I went into it to become
make wine.
a winemaker. But I did have an application where we made wine basically for a customer, someone who had a vineyard, and we made a wine that ended up being high in what's called volatile acidity, basically acetic acid or vinegar, because they picked their grapes and left them sitting in a truck overnight before they hauled them to us. Now we're talking Arizona, and it was 100-degree temperatures at that time of year. So by the time the grapes got to us, there was a lot of leakage out of the grapes, and some of this juice had already started to spoil. But the customer wanted us to make wine, so we made wine. Well, it still had that defect of the acetic acid that was in there. And I've been trying to think of the name of the people who had developed a process using RO. Do you recall, Dean?
Ariel?
Yeah, I don't remember the name, unfortunately.
I'll try to come up with it. But anyway, they had worked out a process where they used a combination of RO and ion exchange. They would use a membrane that would let the acetic acid pass through. Then they would run that permeate through, I think, anion exchange. to take out the acetate and replace it with hydroxide, and then you would mix the two streams back together again. So I actually, years later did end up using RO. We rented equipment from a company that specialized in that kind of equipment for correcting wine defects.
Right.
We ran formal application tests where we charged people, and we actually probably had 10 different alcohol recovery or wine adjustment type tests. And the craziest thing that I've ever heard of anybody doing with NF, we did develop for Miller, and that was we used NF to make clear beer.
Well, this was in the days when everything was going clear.
Yeah.
If you remember there, I can't remember the date, but everybody wanted to have a clear something or other.
Right.
And so they came up with clear beer, which actually was fantastic. It was like, because the alcohol went through preferentially, and you held back all the proteins in that, so you actually had a little bit of beer taste, not much, but it was like a very nice wine.
They brewed it a little bit stronger because they last a little bit in the fractionation process, but they came out with a clear beer and test marketed it in 3 markets, and we were building our second big machine for them when they pulled it off the market and turned the machine into back to Kraft, I think, which the same company owned, and turned it into a dairy. But yeah, that was a rather strange idea, but they had clear Pepsi and clear dishwashing and soap
right.
and stuff.
Yeah.
It was all marketing. That was back when you got beer, your share of beer, the market by clever marketing, I guess.
Did you, while you were doing the testing, did you get to, test the product to
We
make
did.
sure you're doing
they
okay?
gave us some cases, and our employees got to test it, and it had a kick.
We got a 55-gallon drum of Jack Daniels that I had them decant a gallon of so that we could do a taste comparison to everything else that we produced, too. And that was a fun test.
See, I told you that degree would come in handy.
And one of the things we did, Ian, that goes back to my feeling that you really want to be a businessman first, we never did a free test for anybody. Maybe a little bit once in a while, but never did a free test. We always charged to do a test. And then both Dave and Fran did a lot of the testing on these special things. Our customer would come in. If you didn't have the ability to give us a $500 purchase order, you didn't get anything tested. And that was the best thing going because all the riffraff stayed away.
Yeah.
And we had only things that people thought were viable.
That's something I learned from Dean pretty much from day one that has stuck with me ever since, which was if you give people something for nothing, that's the value they put on it.
Exactly.
And so any business or job I've been in, I keep that in mind.
Yeah, I've always followed that rule in my consulting career. Yeah, a lot of people think that you do them a favor, that what you tell them is actually worth something. So I said, if it's worth something, then you can pay me for it.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to make sure I brought into this, because I don't think a lot of people know this history. But we were very close with North Star Research. And we did a lot of inner discussion with John Cadott and his people. And about 1976, we were testing their NS1 and 2 and looking at making it. And John called up and said, can you make me some ultrafiltration membrane on your coater? And I said, sure, we can do that. He said, but I want it to be polysulfone, and I want it to be a certain way. So his assistant, Clint Kopp, who's unfortunately not able to be here, but actually is a great membrane guy. He passed away about 4 years ago, same age as I am. And after moving from North Star to Baxter and developing artificial kidney, and then developing the MIMCOR membrane in Australia. But anyway, Clint came over with a solution of polysulfone, and we started to coat it. And the first thing we did is it hit the water bath, it turned into a rope because of the way that the water was removed so fast that the polysulfone was shrinking. And Cadet then came up with a material, I can't remember the exact chemical name now, but all of us started using it that were messing with polysulfone, that allowed slower water removal and kept it flat. So then we coated the polysulfone. We gave him, because he supplied the solution and gave us the formulation, we gave him the membrane for free. And that's what he used to make his the NS30 and TFC. And we continued close relationship with FilmTech more or less until Dow took him over. But certainly, in my book, your first great invention was Suryaраjan's ability to put a dense layer on top of the cellulose acetate. And the second one, and the one that's really prevailed at this point, was John Cadet with in situ reaction on the polysulfone. And it's unfortunate that both John and Clint aren't around for this group, and but I do consider both of them to be a true pioneer in this industry, and I know everybody knows Cadet is, but a lot of people don't know that much about Clint.
When John Cadet first started making the thin film composite membrane, did you have any ideas that this might be something that you would want to own?
I wondered if you're going to ask me my biggest mistake or whatever. I started thinking that this should be something we work in when he was NS1 and NS2, and then they fell apart after we tested them. You know, remember they'd go bad in about 2 weeks of running on sodium chloride, and I'd worked with John when he was putting a thin coating on triacetate and things like that, and because he was such a fun guy to get to know. But boy, then I just like, oh, we've spent a lot of money at this NS1 and NS2. I don't know if I want to mess with it. So Erickson, Peterson, and I can't remember if Larson was there at that time or not, but they said, "Can we buy you lunch?" I said, "Sure." And so they picked my head on how you start a company. And then they said, "Well, would you like to buy part of a startup for $25,000?" And I thought to myself, let me think about it. And I thought about it, and I thought, God, I've wasted so much money with these guys. I think maybe I shouldn't do it. That was a mistake. They say the third time's the one that's the best, so I should have done it. And we would have been part owner of FilmTech and probably been more successful than we were.
Yeah, I remember that I was working at Hydronautics right after they started, and we had the Iron Water Association. Roy had sent us a 2.5 by 20-inch element to test in parallel to the CA plant down there.
Right.
And it was so good. When I went to Hydronautics, I suggested to Jim Bartlett that he buy FilmTech because they were struggling to make their own TFC
and Jim probably wishes he'd done the same as I did.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I think I recall it as a total coincidence, but FilmTech rented a space right across the railroad tracks, exactly across the railroad tracks from Osmonic's second location, by total coincidence, because we're sitting on the back dock eating lunch and looking across the railroad tracks, and here's the FilmTech workers right there next to us. And to this day, I mean, Minneapolis is actually kind of becoming a RO manufacturing center, since Dow still puts out everything, and GE is invested in their membrane there, so it's kind of a center now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the question of the patent probably is worth discussing a little bit, because those of us that had an OSW contract and had read all the detail in it, which I did when I was in college, and then I didn't have any contracts at Osmonics, but I had them in college, knew that the contract said that it was, first of all, a public license for all American citizens, but secondly, if you invented something And anytime, I think within a year after you left the contract, that was still the government's property. And unfortunately, the guys at Film Tech didn't tell Dow that. And maybe they didn't know it. And of course, Hydronautics was the one that fought the battle for the rest of us. And it eventually prevailed, showing that Cadet had invented it within a year after leaving Norsar and his contract. And you know, that made one of the biggest changes, I think, in our industry, because all of a sudden, the 4 or 5 companies that were competing, we could all start to make membrane with the TFC idea. And then you had Dow, which very cleverly said, well, if we're going to do that, we better cut the price so that new companies don't get excited about the profits. And they cut that price, and everybody wondered what was going to happen. And you know, it just blossomed the business, because it was like when the PC prices, the personal computer prices were cut. You remember how the personal computer took off?
Yep.
And we had the same phenomena. It was an exciting time, and that was about the time that I started working closer with Don Bray, who had developed desalination systems. And Don's about 20 years older. He's no longer around, but he was at that time 20 years older, and we started talking about the benefits of combining, and we eventually bought Desalination Systems and gave us our business, the Osmonics Vista operation. But and we were making TFC membrane both in Minnetonka and at Vista. So.
Well, I think it's worth mentioning that the government, when the government took ownership of the patent, they decided to license it out to everybody, and we were trying to make our own TFC membrane, and they said, okay, you know, we were putting it out in the field to test, and they said, you got to pay us, and Dean said, I don't think we have to pay him. So Dean didn't like lawyers much, so he put me on these things, and I called up a guy, and he came in and said, help us figure out how much it's going to cost if we fight the government. And so we said, hey, we're not going to pay this. Dean had a legal theory that kind of worked out, that the government should have owned that patent at the time. And if they'd owned it at the time it was invented, everybody would have had a royalty-free license. So we sent the government a letter that said, no, we're not going to pay you.
Yeah, well, the patent was wasn't based on the TFC concept, because Fluid Systems had already developed that with the PA membrane.
Yeah, it was
based on the chemistry.
Yeah.
Right.
And I was working on about 3 projects at the time, all of which were supposed to use hydronautics. They started rapidly trying to develop something a little bit different. So we had TCM 1, 2, and 3, which is temporary composite membrane 1, 2, and 3 in these 3 plants. And actually 3, the membranes lasted about 7 years.
Well, yeah, and I think Bray called his TFL or something, thin film layer.
Thin layer.
Film layer,
TLC, thin layer composite.
Yeah.
Tender loving
That
care.
was-
Tender loving care.
Yeah, that was an interesting time.
It was an interesting time, but I do think that the competition made us all better companies.
Oh, yeah.
But it also gave the customers very good value, because now we could price. We were actually, starting to price machines at a level where you could afford to put them in a lot of places.
After a few years, you had this company going, and you were doing well, and you were watching the bottom line, and those guys were spending the bottom line. You did something that kind of surprised me at the time. You went into the municipal market, where, according to everybody that I know, there's absolutely zero profit margin.
Well, we went into small municipal and kind of specialty municipal. And one of the things we were very strong in pollution control, and half our business during the 70s was pollution control, which was very profitable business because nobody else wanted to do it in the membrane area. And then we had the recession in '81. And I stepped back and kind of said, gee, I don't like the fact that I had to lay off 5 or 6% of our people because we just didn't have the sales. So I said, I don't want to be so tight to one area. So at that point, we started to diversify into other technologies and into other marketplaces. And one of the guys that I would have been nice to be here, but he didn't start with me until '81, so, is Lee Combe, who took our membranes and not only went municipal, but went to Coca-Cola and went to some of the other beverage companies and really made us a big name in the beverage and in the smaller municipal area. And part of that, then we acquired a cartridge filler business from Celanese. We acquired ozone business. We did a number of acquisitions. I think for
Did you acquire Tonka pumps?
we invented Tonka.
You invented
pumps.
Tonka
We invented
pumps.
Tonka pumps because there was we were in the kidney dialysis business, and those machines were smaller, and you couldn't get a pump that worked very well. And the one guy in the business was using the motor bearing as the thrust bearing, and that was burning out the motor when they'd run it for 2 weeks straight or something. So I went to Weber and I said, "What do you say we fund your development of a bearing system?" And the guy laughed at me and said, "We don't need to do that." So I said, "Well then, okay, we'll make our own pumps." So then we developed a bearing system, which then allowed the motors not to burn out, and then developed the pumps, up into the couple 100 gallons a minute.
Right.
I'm pretty sure we were not only the most vertically integrated membrane company in terms of making, components and
sure.
stuff, but then when we started branching out into all these other associated water treatment technologies, we were, I don't know what you call it, we were very broad. And there was a period where we were all worried if Dean went out of town and we didn't know where he was because he was going to come back with another company. And it was going to always be something new, comes back, we bought an ozone company, you're now an ozone expert, start reading.
Well, I thought that ozone would become the standard for like Giardia treatment in municipal. And other companies did, some other companies did too, but the problem was that there was some boron in some of the water, and the borates
Borate got to be a
became
problem.
a problem.
Yeah.
So ozone has never blossomed into what I thought
That's
it would.
right.
But
Even today, I mean,
even
it's
today,
still,
yeah.
it's still probably the one technology that has the most promise,
Right.
but it's still not very widely applied.
No, and I think I'm not sure exactly why that became such a big deal, but somebody did a good job of fighting it. The chlorine guys, I think, did a good
Well,
job
it's
of
a
fighting
Safe
it.
Drinking
Yeah.
Water Act. I mean,
Right.
borate is an issue.
Right. But we bought about 2 companies a year for about 16 years, I guess. Or not, product lines and companies.
Right. Did you ever think about using or developing or working on developing a hollow fiber membrane to compete with DuPont and Dow?
We never really looked at a hollow fiber. We didn't really feel we wanted to do that. But when Clint Kopp came back, when U.S. Filter bought the Memtech business and Memcor, Clint didn't get along with Dick Heckman too well, and so he came back to the Midwest, and we started working together on developments. He actually was the guy that helped invent the Z-Plex cartridge filler that we had. He and I were going to, after GE bought us, we were going to do a flat sheet hanging type of MBR system, because he had done hollow fiber. He knew a lot of the problems with the hollow fiber, and he felt that we could do that. And unfortunately, though, he passed away, like I said, and we never did do anything. But I never really got interested in the hollow fiber, with the exception of the fact that I did talk to Xenon and about doing some things together, but he was Andrew was not the easiest guy in the world to deal with.
I wrote and presented an awful lot of papers attacking the hollow fiber and promoting the spiral over it. I'll say that, probably 15 different papers.
Yeah, but it was interesting because we interviewed the DuPont folks last year, and I asked them the opposite question. Why did you suddenly decide to go into the spiral business? And I don't know that we ever really got a good answer, but it was pretty obvious that they thought that their technology, at least, they couldn't.
That hollow fine fiber,
They
yeah,
wouldn't
that
be
plugged
able
up
to
so-
develop that material to compete with what was happening in the spiral system.
Well, if you go back, to the early days, it is kind of interesting, these big companies, how they, Kodak had the cellulose acetate, very nicely controlled membrane. And when they got their first DuPont permeator to test, they put it on their seawater loop. Of course, everybody had a seawater, test loop. And it performed so well that I think within a month they decided to bail out of the business. And I told them, I said, look, that thing's a filter. And when you put it on real water, it's not going to do what it's doing. And they wouldn't believe me. We actually bought some of their technology at that point. And I said, you can't make a decision based on a test loop. You got to put it in the field. You got to run it where the water's real. And I think that's where DuPont made their mistake. They never, a lot of researchers do that. And they go out and they test it and they think they're doing it, and then they put it in the real world and you got a problem.
Yep. Yeah. About in terms of the size of the systems that you were selling and ultimately sell, what was the biggest system that Osmonics ever built?
Well, prior to GE,
Coke refinery?
yeah, I was going to say maybe Coke refinery or the Boeing job, which was
I don't know that one.
3 or 4 million gallons a day, total turnkey. Everything we did, we put on skids. We had kind of a philosophy that we wanted it to go out of our plant, test it, and which really made it inexpensive because startup was very simple. So, and a lot of the Coca-Cola type and Pepsi-Cola were, some of the bigger ones were 1 million gallons a day. And they weren't just one skid, they'd be a couple of skids, but that's about as big as we did. We really didn't get into the on-site type of RO that a lot of people have moved into in this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think one exception to that would probably be the Clearwater plant,
Yeah.
where you have vertical turbine pumps instead of the skid-mounted.
Well,
horizontal
Will
pumps.
Pergandy came with us, and he had a lot more seawater background, so we did start to expand into some of those areas. But
Did you ever get seriously involved in seawater?
we were getting ready to become much more active in seawater, but we hadn't done it. Like I say, Will came on board, and he had been in the seawater for a long time, and we were moving into some smaller plants in the Cayman Islands and a few of those places.
Mexican Navy we had.
In the
with
Mexican
seawater.
Navy we did, yeah.
Yeah.
They're all small though.
But had trouble seeing the profitability in that area, so we kind of were a little careful about. I always wanted to have 15 to 20% operating profit, and to do that and have 20% SG&A, you had to have 40% minimum gross profit, and most of the other competitors were willing to sell for 30% and sometimes 20% gross
Oh,
margin. And so I just said, hey, life's too short to do that. And so we tended not to.
Yeah, it's one of Jimmy Hearn's greatest complaints. He said people are bidding jobs at my cost.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going through another cycle,
Yeah.
similar to a couple of others we had. I stay close to a couple of us, smaller companies, and I think there is another cycle, and so Harn's talking about what's happening, I'm sure.
I think GE, the experience GE had, from my perspective, kind of proves out that too, because they came in. You might edit this out later, but they came in and said, "Oh, we're going to do big municipal, and forget all this food stuff. It's too much problem, too much regulatory." And I watched this, and then after they realized, well, that's where their profit. This is after GE acquired Osmonics, and all right, now we're cutting out our profit. They didn't realize that at first, and suddenly I guess we're not going to just go big municipal because we're not making any money there. And they thought they could because they were GE, but it didn't work out that way. So they had a big switch in their strategic focus, and that kind of they learned the hard way.
Yeah. When did GE actually acquire Osmonics?
The actual signing date was February 2003.
Why did you decide, after being successful for that many years, that it was time to move on?
Well, I didn't decide. I told you, I think I mentioned earlier, we were a public company starting in 1971. And so we didn't have to go to the bank for any money. We went to the public. And so all those years, very seldom borrowed any money. But there was a slight recession in Asia in '98. And then, of course, we had one in 2000. And we had just acquired a great company. What was it? The one in Membrex.
Membrex, yeah. And NSI, same year.
And Membrex had this water oil separation. And we were going to work with Safety Clean. Well, then Safety Clean went bankrupt because the guys that bought them were overpaid. And so we were in a situation where we had to borrow for the first time. Plus, you had the year 2000 thing coming, and we were putting in SAP. Probably should have never done that in a big way, but we did it. And so we were kind of, and the first time that our profits had dipped, instead of following our sales line, it had dipped down. And at that point, GE was doing their strategy sessions, and they came up with the strategy of water. So when they came and talked to us, as a public company, you really couldn't do anything when a guy like GE comes. You have to talk to him. And they came back about 6 months later. This was in 2001, and then came back in 2002 and said, we've decided that we'd like you guys to be our platform for equipment in the water business. And they already had Betts Chemical to be the.
And they had Glegg too.
Well, they bought Glegg, and they thought we were a big Glegg, because they didn't, like Dave said, they didn't understand the process technology or anything. Didn't even care about it. And but when they told us that, then we had to do what's called a process, where you go and get the bankers, and investment bankers, and we sent out to about 15 companies, and about 7 of those 15 came back with offers. And Pentair and GE were the best offers, but GE's was the best. And we basically, the board said we want an all stock deal, and they agreed to it. And so it wasn't much we could do. And then when they took over, they said, after about 2 weeks, they said, we find, back at headquarters, my headquarters people are telling me that we find entrepreneurs are difficult to fit into our culture. And small company CEOs are difficult too. So we think you probably should leave. And I said, well, you're going to pay me for 3 years. I said, if you want, I'll take a small office in a corner. Come in once a week. People can come in and ask me questions. None of you guys know anything about water. They said, well, we'll do that if we feel like it. Well, they never did anything. Then after another 2 or 3 weeks, they said, why don't you just pack up your office and get out of here? So that was the way it went. Although I do know Jeff Emmett a little bit because he's a fellow Dartmouth guy, and he also same fraternity I was in. So I have talked to him. He did say that the osmonics integration was one of the best they ever had. Partially because the SAP was working so well, and partially, I suppose, because we had a little more structure than some companies. But that's the reason I didn't stay in it. And I'm in a couple of little company startups now. Yeah.
Now, Fran, you had left by this time,
Oh, yes.
so you've never experienced the GE umbrella.
No, not at all.
I experienced it in spades, and I soon became convinced that in my prior life, I had done something very bad. I'd been reincarnated, and now I was being punished. They looked around and said, oh, geez, we have all these regulatory obligations. We're selling everywhere. We don't know if we're in compliance everywhere as much as we need to be. Who can we get to go out and do this stuff? And I didn't draw the short straw. They brought it to me. And then suddenly I was 100% product regulatory. My boss gave me one assignment. Don't let GE's name get in the paper. And don't spend any money either.
My first experience after Osmonics was acquired was I was trying to get an updated version of WinFlows. And I kept on going to the website, and you had to put in an application. It's like you're applying for a job almost.
Right.
And weeks would go by and nothing would happen. So finally, I talked to Bruce Fraser. I said, I've been trying to get WinFlows. He said, you'll never get it from the website because everything comes in, the lawyers review, and if they don't know you, they won't send it to you. I said, well, that's pretty short-sighted. He said, yeah, but that's GE. So.
You want a story of GE lawyers? This is the God's awful truth. They call me up. My boss's boss calls me up and says, we want you on a committee. The tsunami in Banda Aceh wiped out 200,000 people, don't have water. We're going to send 2 big ROs from the Mideast over there, but the lawyers just figured out that RO water might be too pure to drink. It's got some long-term health effects, and we're worried about that, and so we want you on this committee. And I agreed to write an opinion. I wrote an opinion for the lawyers, and with a doctor from GE that, no, you can drink RO water, and parenthetically, it's a lot better than drinking bacteria-laden river water, even if it was a chronic problem, which it's not. And they had to have this letter before they would send this thing, and we're going, where do you guys get these ideas?
Yeah. Well, actually, I noticed that with Siemens as well.
Yeah.
It's the same thing happened when Siemens took over the Memcor business and all this from Dick Heckman. It's the same thing. I mean, they're so risk averse.
I thought it was a Candid Camera episode, and there was a camera in my office. I was looking. I'm on the phone going, "There's got to be a camera in here. They can't possibly be telling me this."
One thing I might mention, Ian, because you were pushing Fran a little bit, he maybe forgets that he did come back and work for us.
Oh, he did.
Yeah. When he always decided he didn't like the real cold weather, so he went down to Arizona. I said, well, as long as you're going to Arizona, if you don't have a job, we could use some help in the ozone business we had in Phoenix. So you worked there for what?
2 years.
2 years.
Yeah.
So he did come back.
But he's back in the winemaking again now.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if are you making wine now or just selling your goods?
I retired about a year ago.
Ah, okay.
No samples.
So I think perhaps as a wrap up to this interview, which for me has been very enjoyable, I'd like you just to, if you would, each of you, to starting with Fran, just to kind of reminisce a little bit about if you would do it again, what you liked and didn't like about the membrane business, and what you're doing now. So, Fran, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I enjoyed it very much. I like being in new areas where you're trying to develop new ideas and new products. And I like the small company atmosphere where you end up wearing a lot of hats and don't, aren't restricted in what you're supposed to be looking at for the good of the company. And I learned a lot from Dean in terms of as he said, the business side of things that was important to him that I had never really had much exposure to. And I basically went on from osmonics and worked in companies where I was pretty much my own boss and was running a number of different operations or aspects of the company, and so I credit a lot of the entrepreneurship that I learned in osmonics to enjoying the jobs that followed that.
Good. Dave?
Well, I have. I have so many years at osmonics. I think after Dean left, I was there 2 years later, so I think I might have worked there longer than he did. So it was a great experience, and I got to see a lot of different things, and just do raw problem solving as the first skill, kind of like what's the best way to handle this, as opposed to taking some formal training and applying equations and stuff to everything. You kind of, what's the best thing we're going to do on this? I appreciated that, and that was a great experience. And you got to see a lot of things. You had to, in osmonics, thanks to Dean's philosophy, you had to look at all aspects, business. We were drilled and grilled on numbers all the time, even though you were technology, so you got a lot of different training, like Fran's talking about too. It was all good. If I had to do it over again, I'd maybe say, hey, I should have stepped back a little bit, and instead of having my nose to the grindstone all that time, said, hey, where's your career arc going? And I might have gotten out, and I'm consulting now, but I probably should have gotten out and started consulting 3 or 5 years earlier. Mm-hmm. But all that experience that I have is definitely helps in the consulting, not just the technical side, but the marketplace and the regulatory and how they're all married together. If you really want to be effective, you don't just look at one narrow part of it. I think that kind of is alluded to both by what Fran said and Dean's business first kind of philosophy. So I'm doing consulting right now, and that I really enjoyed that almost from day one. So
Good. Dean, you're still involved in business a little bit, I understand.
Well, yeah, I've had 50 years of membranes, making them and everything, and it's been totally enjoyable. I am with Volteo, which is a capacitance DI company, and a startup called Liquidity, which is nanofiber membranes. And I've enjoyed all of it. I think, and one of the things with somebody like Dave, I don't look at degrees that much. I look at who can manage and who can do things, and I suppose if I were going to do a little different, I would have liked to find a guy like Lynn Hodgins, who I don't think is on this group, but is one of the best membrane technologists I know, and Phil Richigo, who worked with him as well. I should have probably brought a few of those people in a little bit earlier, because Lynn developed a polysulfamide TFC that I think could have operated with chlorine and gotten to a seawater capability. We have patent on it, but GE hasn't done much with it. So, but it was a fun thing. When we were acquired, we had about 1,400 employees. I think at one time we had 1,500. The most fun is in the early days. I always tell young people that ask me about starting a company and doing it, I say, well, up to 50 people, you can be on top of everything. 50 to 200, you can really enjoy yourself. You know enough about everybody that they're all kind of family. Over 200, it's a totally different management style. And, not many people can do that. As Don Bray got up to a couple hundred, he just had trouble with it. And so I tell a lot of, when I'm working with small startups and that, and helping out some guys like the Jeff Wiggins, who's got Wiggins Water, you kind of have to make a decision where you're going to stop, or where you're going to be comfortable. And that 50 to 200 people is a very comfortable, I found, although some people find it under 50s. And so it's been some fantastic times, and I always enjoyed being public, with the exception of when GE came and forced the issue. And I enjoyed going against Dick Heckman in the presentations for the public stuff, and Dick's a fun guy to deal with, although he's totally non-technical. But that's kind of where I'm coming from, and a couple of these startups are good. I am also on the board of a Sigma Aldrich company, which is $2.7 billion in sales, so it's been kind of fun to see the other side of the fence too.
Good. Well, thank you all very much. This has been most enjoyable, and we'll bring it to a conclusion.
Thank you, Ian.
Thanks.